drugs and psychiatry. In this series we're talking with psychiatrists who know a little bit about drugs, what to do about it. Joe Gross is from New York, he's a psychiatrist there, and today we're going to talking about what happens if a trip goes wrong. Now let's first try to define what it is, a bad trip. Someone takes LSD, mushrooms, ecstasies, and he doesn't really get back to the world the way he was, but in a negative way.
Right, there's been a negative experience which is not always predictable and could be due either to the just the person's inherent negativity problems.
Which means that they had some problems before they just came out to the trip.
Right, that his own personality or experiences are predisposing him to a negative experience. Or it can be completely fortuitous. It could be that he'd had a bad day, or that the conditions or setting under which he tried to use some drugs may themselves have been unpleasant, because there's this tendency for an amplifying effect. If you're just speaking very broadly and generally, if you're taking drugs, the effect will tend to amplify what is already present. So above all, and of course, just to make it clear, I'm not advocating or disadvocating drug use or something. It's something that's being done. There's nothing that you or I can do about it. But above all, the thing to remember is that the experience, if you're having an unpleasant experience, is that the experience will end. It's not going to go on forever. That you're not going to die. You will survive it, and it will end. And usually the unpleasantnesses tend to recede
within a few hours.
Within a few hours, so that it will be over, it will end.
So one thing to do about a bad trip is just reassure the people that this is not the Armageddon and the devil's climbing into their...
Right, and that it is all taking place within your mind. You're not being destroyed by the world. You're not going to destroy the world. That there's no apocalyptical consequence of what you're doing.
Now, sometimes people during a trip have the tendency to say, well, we're on the 50th floor of the Empire State Building. Hey, there's a glass window here we don't really need. I can control the world, why can't I fly? And they jump out. Now, you might not call it a bad trip, but coming down, it's probably an unpleasant experience.
Undoubtedly. Well, there are always people who are going to do crazy things. But clearly, I mean, one should be in as safe, as secure an environment as possible, and not to have any unexpected interruptions and so forth. In other words, you have to be intelligent about it and not just have, which unfortunately is very common, a very casual approach to
you think that is dangerous, that people go to a nightclub or a disco or a house party and someone says, hey, I have a nice pill for you, and they take it and they embark on something they don't really want?
Yes, well, I wouldn't say it's dangerous, but I don't see why anyone would do that, although people are doing things like that all the time. And of course, even taking things they're not even sure what they are.
What is that, peer pressure?
It's laziness, I would say, including peer pressure and pusher pressure and all of these things. Well, at some future point, hopefully this will all be integrated into some socially valuable and acceptable context. Unfortunately, in our culture, the use of drugs for spiritual development is not taking place in any spiritual context, generally speaking. There are some churches that are doing that.
Especially in America, there are some the Native American church can use peyote.
Right, I'm not sure what the present status is. There's always a back and forth between the government as to whether there should be interference with religious activities, including peyote use. And I know that ayahuasca is being used by churches in Brazil.
Yeah, the Santo Daime.
Santo Daime, and there's another Unio Vegetal. And that has been approved by the Brazilian legislature, as far as I know. It was first approved, then it was disapproved, now it's approved again. And of course, that provides a totally different context for these experiences. And I'm sure that will evolve. I mean, it was interesting. I was at a psychedelic conference in San Francisco November last year, and I was really surprised to see the amount of high quality research of cultural uses in many cultures going back thousands and thousands of years of these psychedelics. It was much more than I would have expected, and the whole thing, of course, has faded out of consciousness as people have gotten away
And
from
you're
basics.
talking, of course, about what happened in Mexico, the veladas with the mushrooms. There seem to be rituals in Mongolia, also with mushrooms. There's a lot all over the world.
In India, in Africa, in so many places and cultures that go literally back tens of thousands of years in some cases. In South America, they found, the reason they can tell it, of course, they find the ritual objects, which clearly were meant
the puppets with heads of mushrooms and
right, and boards for chopping and preparing snuff and things like that. So it's quite interesting, and I'm sure it's going to be an increasingly important part of the human culture. There's just
but yet people are afraid. And we were talking about it once you always hear LSD, oh yes, but a bad trip. Now you as a psychiatrist, you have some patients who not only had a bad trip, but afterwards had bad effects. What to do about it?
Well, of course, I mean, if someone's coming to me for help, they've already been self-selected, of the thousands of people who've tried these drugs at various times and places, the ones who've had bad trips, and in some cases there are bad trips which continue, but they're very rare. I wouldn't want to emphasize that at all. It's like a rare disease. I mean, some people catch it, but it's possible.
Leary wrote a book called Flashbacks, and so we all have the idea that from LSD you might have flashbacks.
Oh, yes. And of course some people do. Well, this comes down to really how to avoid unpleasant experiences. And as I said, the best thing is in proper preparation and in being in a safe and inspiring context. Not necessarily in a dance hall with people jumping around and all kinds of things going on.
These flashbacks, now I sometimes I've used LSD, and sometimes I come back maybe in nature or whatever to a state that I would say, hey, this resembles what I experienced during LSD, or through Zen meditation or whatever. I have a feeling all these states are similar. And I don't find it unpleasant. I would say, hey, give me those flashbacks any day, because that's nice.
Yeah, those positive flashbacks.
But maybe is that a chemical reaction that happened in your mind?
Well, everything is chemical. It's like sometimes you can suddenly recall a dream that you had years ago. Suddenly it comes into the mind. It's a flashback from the dream. Is that chemical?
No, sometimes that is induced by a smell, a very strong. You suddenly remember your childhood puppets, or oh yes, that was how it was.
Right. Well, of course, you can't always tease out the links of association. I mean, what actually produces recall in the mind, events, memories, all that kind of thing.
But do you feel as a psychiatrist, I mean, New York is a big city, there are lots of people use drugs and very strange drugs. Are you saying the New York mental hospitals are full with people after bad trips that really have to be in cages?
Oh, no, nothing like that. I mean,
that's an exaggerated...
The problem really is that people who want to escape from their condition, whether it's their personality or their environment, tend to take drugs, and they tend to mix drugs now. People tend to take, whatever is around.
Ranging from glue to LSD to cocaine and everything.
Right, but usually cocaine, alcohol, speed, heroin, whatever suits them. It's
strange combinations of uppers and downers and
right. And those are the real problems and social problems. The psychedelics I don't see as a general social problem, although, of course, the age at which people are introduced to these things tends to get lower and lower. It's the pusher effect. And so there's...
And with pusher you mean the reason that people make money from selling it, so that they go to the school doors
exactly
and sell it to the children, they get children get hooked. But do you get hooked on LSD?
Well, no, you don't get hooked on it, but you know, the older cell to the younger cell to the still younger. There tends to be that kind of ripple effect. But I don't see that as in and of itself dangerous. But of course, if you have a disturbed family life or a disturbed personality, you may have a disturbing trip. But there are no absolute rules.
Mm-hmm. Now, about these family problems, so people like Gene Houston say, yeah, well, one of the problems of society is that we don't have rite of passage. You know, in the old days, Jewish boys, 12 years old, they're the bar mitzvah and other
13,
excuse me. Other societies they have at 17 or even at 7, but there are usually rites of passage, and it seems that those have a equalizing effect on the psychological feelings of the kids. They are taken through some kind of process. They all come out, and they all have a new start. Even if you were a bad child, you have a chance to be a good boy, and if you were a bad boy, you have a chance to be a good man. Sometimes you're taken out of your social structure, put in another house. You go from the boys' house to the men's house. Psychologically, it seems that it has some healthy effects. Now, we don't have that anymore. I mean, you have juvenile
gangs.
You go from gang to this jail or that jail,
right.
But that's not what we mean. Would you think that kids take drugs as a replacement for rites of passage?
Well, I guess you could say that. I mean, they take drugs, in order to you might really to escape from the present reality into some other kind of experience, other kind of reality. But that escape, you might say, tends to have an antisocial context, whereas in traditional or so-called primitive societies, traditional societies, the process isn't against society, it's part of growing up. And the rituals are very elaborate and interesting. I mean, it's something that's just about totally gone from modern urban culture. But I'm sure it'll come back. It may take 1 or 2 dozen years, but I'm sure as I see it, the ritual forms are very advantageous because they provide a secure context for experiencing other states of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Now, we had them in the past. They were called Elysian mysteries. Right. Maybe I think we should have something called the Millennium Mysteries and take the whole world to a trip on January 1, the year 2000. But maybe that goes too far. Joe, thank you for explaining about what a New York psychiatrist has to do with bad trips and the healthy effects of it too.
Thank you very much. I'm glad. I hope I've shed a little tiny bit of enlightenment on this whole interesting and complex subject.
Thank you. Een interessante man, die Joe Gross. Maar ook het volgende interview is de moeite waard. Met iemand die uit de